Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 1, Topic 1. We've made the turn from the course introduction the first week of class, making sure folks want to stick around and giving a chance for people to come over from the other version of IS 310 if they wish, into the meat and potatoes of the UN. We're talking in Unit 1 about things that sort of underpin the rest of what we're going to look at. You'll notice that in topic and sort of in Unit 1, we won't be looking at any real in-depth projects that the UN does. We won't look at development, for example, or what they do with children or the environment. Right now, we're talking about the way the organization as a whole operates. So we'll take that kind of concept in Unit 1, the overarching themes that sort of underpin the rest of the organization. Then in Unit 2, we'll look at still the organization as a whole and the way it approaches certain topics. And then in Unit 3, we'll shift to a regional specific look and then a country specific look. But we've got to start here with the way that the organization itself is founded and how that sort of relates to how the organization operates. But we're going to start with this, what I would call an equation first, sovereignty over benefits. It's something that a lot of IS seniors will refer back to when they're in the capstone class and talking about policymaking and whether they get countries to agree to something or not. This exchange. So what I'm going to posit is that on some level, this is a very simple conversation. It's much more complex, and we'll look at the complexity as we go along. But you take sovereignty, you compare it to the number of benefits that you might accrue to you if you surrender some sovereignty, and you balance those two together, and you come up with a decision on whether to join an organization or not. But of course, we have to look at things more in depth. But start with this, finish with this, think of this as we go along. Sovereignty over benefits. So let's start with sovereignty, and we will get rid of me. There we go. Sovereignty is one of those topics that I'm sure all of you have heard of before. It's also one of those words that while you've heard of them and you kind of know what they are, if someone suddenly says to you, hey, define this for me, you might stumble a little bit. I certainly remember grad school when we'd be having these high-level intellectual conversations. We sort of leapt past the basic concepts, and then the professor would occasionally say, okay, define this for me, and it would a word like socialism or capitalism, and you know what they are, but you don't want to be on the spot because you're not ready to rattle off a definition. Sovereignty is like that. You know that sovereignty is a thing that refers to countries somehow being able to act in their own stead. So we're going to look at these two parts here, and you can remember some really basic definitions. So the original definition of sovereignty goes back to the sovereigns, the rulers, the kings, queens, and the rest of the gang, particularly in Europe, but other places as well, who possess supreme power. So at its basic definition is supreme power to do what you want, and it was possessed by individuals. And if I may, the designer in me, the web designer in me, is a little uncomfortable with this picture because the way Louis XIV is facing him and his horse and his pike or whatever he's got there, his jousting stick is facing off the screen, and you're supposed to always get your people looking at your slides to look into this slide. But anyway, there he is looking off the screen. He had supreme power. Remember, he's the guy who has the famous quote, I am the state, or the state it is me, where all the power in the realm devolved to him. So he had supreme power. So the concept eventually is going to shift to states in the modern era. So you've got the other definition of sovereignty is the right or ability of a state to govern itself and or others. So in this case, you're not talking about a sovereign ruler, but a sovereign state. And what I mean by the ability of a state to govern itself and others, that would be, when a country might have possession of another land, so it's governing an other, so it could be sovereign over that territory. There's all kinds of gradations, right, where you have different agreements that gives different rights to different countries over different territories. One of the activities we'll do later in the semester is looking at colonization and decolonization today. So a lot of people think of those as completed processes, but there are more than a dozen colonies identified by the UN where there still is some relationship of those states ruling over those colonies in some way. And so that is an ability of a state to govern others. So if you put these two together, you basically have a country being able to govern itself, to have supreme power over itself. So if you start with, I don't know, a pure ball of sovereignty that devolves to a country like the United States, or to Argentina or to Fiji, that they start with all of it and then it gets shared out in different ways if they want or if they're forced to. So what I mean by if they're forced to is you certainly had, for example, in Hawaii, a sovereign state that existed prior to the colonization by the British and the Americans. Eventually, the Americans went out. That sovereign state could control itself until a more powerful state arrived, overtook it, and then the sovereignty devolved to the United States. Now, there is still some attempt in the United States, for example, to give indigenous people a certain amount of sovereignty, but it's not supreme. So you just kind of balance these two things out. So if you start with this ball of everything, of having everything you can devolve to a country, supreme power, its ability to govern others, then you introduce this concept called IGOs. So the UN is an IGO. It's an intergovernmental organization. These are organizations to which countries formally belong. The governments, the executive branches in particular, belong to these organizations. And there are dozens of these in all kinds of places doing all kinds of things. So some of them are part of the UN and the related UN family of organizations. As we'll see going forward, the UN is really a problematic concept because the UN as an organization has so many subparts and sub-member states that it's hard to say, yeah, that's what the UN is and does, because there could be exceptions. For example, right below it here, you've got a symbol of the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, which governs basically traffic at sea and how you flag ships, what laws exist on the ocean, not in the ocean, how much tonnage can be in, all kinds of things. And that is part of the UN, but if I asked you to define the UN, you might not say it's got a maritime organization, a meteorological organization, an aviation organization. Those are all subparts. But they're IGOs. Others are regional organizations dedicated to some particular purpose. So you've got several symbols here. ASEAN is in Southeast Asia. Mercosur is an economic grouping in South America. BIMSTEC happens to be one that's in the Bay of Bengal, so it has places like Sri Lanka and India and Pakistan and Bangladesh in it. The cool one there with the palm tree and the ocean and the stars is the Pacific Forum for Pacific Island states. You even have some that are cultural instead of regional. So the Organization for Islamic Cooperation is an IGO made up of states whose commonality is not that they are all in a place, but they all practice a particular religion as their primary affiliation. And then ECOWAS is an economic community of West African states. All of these required the member states to surrender some degree of sovereignty, that great ball of sovereignty, to cut up into pieces. So what they basically have to do is decide, should we trade some of our rights to have supreme power or the ability to do whatever we want to do in that particular field to an organization to act collectively. Now, that's not the only way you can give up sovereignty. It's not only through IGOs, because you can do bilateral or smaller multilateral agreements where, for example, the United States and Canada get together and they have a treaty mechanism dedicated to the flow of the Columbia River. Right? That's a river that the two of us share, that other countries don't share, but we get together and decide what to do. Same thing in the South, where there's a transboundary water commission between the U.S. and Mexico, where we trade the sovereign right to do whatever we want with that water to each other for better management thereof. All of those are individual conversations about whether the sovereignty you would surrender is worth the benefit you would get. And these exist in so many places. Let's look at the first ones that emerged, the emergence of IGOs back in the mid to late 1800s. So you usually start with this idea of sovereignty as something that has to do with your direct ability to control your military. Like people are thinking of war and peace, and that is a major consideration. Will you be dragged into a conflict? And as we'll see in topic 1.2, one of the things that kept us out of the League of Nations, the main thing that kept us out of the League of Nations, was the desire not to be dragged into military conflict. But it didn't mean we rejected all IGOs, because we were part of a lot of things that made our lives better and easier, where we decided that the exchange of sovereignty was worth the benefit we were going to get. So the first two of these, one's in 1865, one's in 1874. So this ITU is currently UN organization, sub-organization called the International Telecommunications Union. It's sort of inherited the mantle of all things transnational communications that are technological. So you had telegraphs, telephones, and telecommunications as it sort of evolved over the years. And so in 1865, you had to have conversations in their first gatherings where they're discussing what does it mean when the telegraph lines go from one country to the next? Do you want your messages passed along? How much will it cost to pass it along? How long is a message? How much should the tariffs be? Do you have the right to intercept them and send them somewhere else? What language can they be in? All those sorts of things matter in the conversation because technically, if you start with that ball of sovereignty in relation to telegraph communications, you could do whatever you wanted when the message came to you. The problem is that that implies that the other country also can do whatever it wants when the message comes to it. You can add big penalty fees, you can cut their wires, you can do whatever. The Universal Postal Union is similar to that because the conversation is what do you want to have happen with the mail that passes from one country to the next? Either because you're sending a letter from one to the other or a package or whatever it is, or it's passing through on its way to another. And one of the things that if any of you sent international mail either from the United States to somewhere else or from somewhere else to the United States, remember, you didn't pay both countries, right? You paid the local post office, that nation's post office, and somehow money got exchanged somewhere that made sure that the delivery state still accepted it and paid for it and didn't like hold it up and send a note to either you or to the recipient to say, no, the postage has to be paid here too, right? It's a conversation where they decide that surrender of sovereignty, of your right to do whatever you want with the postal stuff, is worth it. Now, a lot of places, they don't think it's worth it in other fields. For example, this telegraph picture shows both the wires being laid next to railroad tracks. And there were attempts to harmonize the size of, do you see this here? This would be the width of the tracks, which has to do with the axle on the train, so the distance apart of the wheels. To harmonize that, because there are others even what they call gauges of the rail lines. And it was decided they did not want to exchange sovereignty for benefits on that front, both for commercial purposes, because you back different rail manufacturers, different rail lines, but also for military purposes, because once the trains could move troops and war material fast and quickly, you might have an interest to have them have to stop their train at a border and switch, if they're on the train, onto a different track, a different train, to slow them down and give you a chance to prepare. Otherwise, they might roll on down the tracks from their capital to yours and threaten you. So it doesn't mean that you were going to do it in everything, but once you start this concept of looking at sovereignty over benefits in relation to almost anything, then there's almost no end to what you can consider, right? And we're talking about satellites in space and what you can do in Antarctica and how many whales you can hunt, etc. So I do want to emphasize here at the end of this conversation the sovereignty over benefits, which I need you to remember for the rest of forever. I mean, you could probably get a tattoo or something that'll help you. We should have like a class tattoo day. Sovereignty over benefits. It's not a predictable linear equation. It's more complicated. And we're going to review these three concepts as we go forward. That crisis may precipitate a logical conversation. And what you'll find with the UN, for example, is the crisis of World War II, following quickly on the heels of World War I, meant that states were more willing in 1945 to trade sovereignty for the benefits of not having a world war. So this is what you might consider a less tangible benefit because, on the one hand, you can see your letter being delivered, and that happens repeatedly all the time, and you feel the exchange, the benefits of that exchange regularly. Whereas you might forget between 1945 and 2017 that not having a world war was the main rationale, and begin to question your decision on the sovereignty over benefits exchange. Anyway, that's one. National interest would be another. So if you have a national interest in a particular region, you don't want to give up a colony, you don't want to change the size of your rail lines, it will change whether you have the sovereignty over benefits exchange. And public opinion might change it too, just if there's something that the country either feels very strongly about, or politics would suggest that you might get elected if you oppose something more so than if you favor the trade of sovereignty over benefits. It could flip things. So there's some caveats. I would hope that these are the kind of things that you throw into your additional thoughts on your reading notes or lecture notes. But sovereignty over benefits is not a linear, predictable equation because of those three caveats. Regardless, joining an IGO requires a careful consideration of potential benefits that surrendering sovereignty brings, or vice versa. You may take it and say, hey, I'm going to surrender sovereignty. Let's consider the surrender of benefits. It could go either way depending on the country. But it is a conversation about sovereignty over benefits that continues nonstop. We're having this in 2017. We had it in 45. You'll read Bora talking about 1919, and it's going to keep going in the future too.